Good evening. My name is Alexie Maclure, and I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships here at Massey College. And on behalf of Acting Principal Jonathan Rose, I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which Massey College operates. It is the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I want to acknowledge the duty of stewardship to this land and the great privilege we have to do our work here. So welcome to the last of 5 events held in partnership with the Royal Society of Canada. It's been a pleasure working with colleagues at RSC, and we hope you have enjoyed the breadth of programming that we've covered this past academic term. We examined on how to work together to improve health and well-being for older adults, the challenges and opportunities that AI presents to the arts world, looked at the sustainability of oceans, and this evening we will discuss freedom of expression. I welcome to the podium Dr. Sheila Embleton, who is President of Academy of Arts and Humanities at the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Embleton is a distinguished research professor of linguistics at York University and sits as the interim president and vice chancellor at Laurentian University of Sudbury. Dr. Embleton, over to you.
Merci, Emily. Good afternoon, bon après-midi. Je m'appelle Sheila Embleton, and you've already heard my introduction, so I can skip over that. I should just clarify that, in fact, I just finished my time at Laurentian as interim president. I'm currently on leave from Laurentian. On July 1st. The Royal Society of Canada is very pleased to be back at Massey College, following a series of successful events here prior to the pandemic. The first 3 events in this new series were held here in late 2023 and early 2024. Discussions of, as you just heard, the health and well-being of the elderly, arts and artificial intelligence, and the sustainability of our oceans. I'm pleased to be here today for the discussion of freedom of expression. The Royal Society of Canada is a single organization made up of its 3 constituent academies and the RSC College. For this series of RSC dialogues at Massey College, each of these 4 bodies has been responsible for organizing one event. Our speakers today, Professors Maclure and Tcheuyap, who will be introduced momentarily, agreed to present before any of us knew exactly how topical our dialogue would be. And of course, they were invited and speak today in their capacity as prominent scholars on this topic. Thank you to Massey College for hosting and providing this venue, not only for this event, but the previous 3 events as well. It's an added pleasure for me, as I was a junior fellow here at Massey College many years ago, and am currently a senior fellow. Thank you also to our moderator, Emily Nicolas, also a former junior fellow at Massey. I would like also to acknowledge with very sincere thanks the role of Professor Solange Lefebvre de l'Université de Montréal, co-titulaire de la chaire collective France-Québec sur les enjeux contemporains de la liberté d'expression, COLIBEX. Et en anglais, Professor Solange Lefebvre, one of 8 co-chairs, 4 from France and 4 from Quebec, of COLIBEX, the collective France-Quebec Research Chair on Freedom of Expression. Among other things, she introduced me to Professor Maclure, which was obviously an important part of designing today's event, and I encourage you to look at their website. Et maintenant, il me fait grand plaisir de vous présenter Émilie Nicolas. Madame Nicolas is a columnist with Le Devoir and host of Canada Land's podcast, Détour. She is also a frequent media commentator, analyst, public speaker, educator, and consultant on public policy, equity, human rights, international cooperation, race, and gender issues. She's a regular contributor to CBC and Radio-Canada and has been published in several journals, magazines, and newspapers, both in French and in English. Émilie is the recipient of a Harry Jerome Award for leadership along with the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons case. Émilie.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Bonsoir tout le monde. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before we go into the actual talk and I introduce our guests, I just want to check in with the room because the talk was supposed to happen upstairs where we would have had access to simultaneous translation, and our amazing guests have prepared remarks that are bilingual. So can I ask you, in a show of hand, how many people here actually understand French? Okay, so maybe half. So what I'm going to do is moderate mostly in English because I want to, the point of it is to be understood. And apologize for the logistical issue. I know that people have access to translation on an app because it's AI generated, and so you can use that on your phone, and you do have access to the app. I will ask the guests to speak in whatever language they want. And I will offer as much as I can summary as well of the parts that people might have missed, so that this event is both bilingual as intended and accessible, which is sometimes hard to do in the absence of technology, but we'll make it work because this is Canada, and we've seen worse. This is, the country's still whole. We figured this out. So I hope you will bear with us. So here with me to do this amazing exercise is first Jocelyn Maclure, who is a professor of philosophy and Alexie Chair in Human Nature Technology at McGill University. He has published extensively on questions related to value pluralism, cultural diversity, democratic deliberation, and human rights. He now mostly works on the various ethical issues raised by artificial intelligence. His book, Secularism and Freedom of Conscience, co-authored with Charles Taylor, appeared in several languages. And from 2017 to 2024, he served as the president of the Commission de l'éthique en sciences et en technologie du Québec. And he was elected at the Academy of the Arts and Humanities of the Royal Society of Canada in 2023. Can I get some energy and a round of applause for Jocelyn? Next, we have Alexie Tcheuyap, full professor, associate vice-president and vice-provost at the University of Toronto, visiting professor in South Africa, the United States, Germany, and France. His scholarship focuses on African literary, cinema, and media studies. In addition to dozens of articles in various journals and collectives, he has directed and co-directed numerous publications. Amongst the several books he has published are Autoritarisme, presse, and violence au Cameroun, Avoir, peur, and African documentary cinema. He is a senior fellow of the European Institute for Advanced Studies and at Massey College, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Can I get some energy as well for Alexie? Okay, so now we're going to speak freely. What else to do at a freedom of expression event? I want to just start before I leave Jocelyn make his first remark to say that it is very timely and opportune time to have a conversation about freedom of expression on a university campus. And that I was especially glad to have the opportunity to moderate this event tonight because I feel that a lot of words and concepts around freedom of expression are being thrown around a lot, especially in the media, by people who haven't been in Jocelyn's philosophy class and Alexie's classes as well. And so I thought that tonight might be a really good opportunity to go back to the basics and make sure that we at least have a common understanding of the concepts that are being used every day, every hour of the day in the public sphere and in the public square as we're speaking now. And I encourage you to listen to those presentations and prepare questions with that in mind, that we're trying to have a better understanding of the concepts that are defining our lives and our social relationships right now, and make sure that we are able to use them in a way that fosters actual dialogue and understanding and community. On that note, Jocelyn, do you want to start it?
All right. Okay, merci beaucoup, Émilie, pour cette gentille présentation. Thank you so much, Sheila, and everyone at the Royal Society for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight. Although this is a very difficult topic, and I see that raises many difficult and delicate issues, but very important. So I think it's probably an understatement to say that the status of freedom of expression is contested today, right? As Émilie said, and just to think about a few examples from what's going on around the world lately. I spent some time in Germany as a visiting prof in the past few months, and in Germany right now, if you can be a Jewish person criticizing the Israeli state for its response to the horrible attack by Hamas, and you can be described as being anti-Semitic, right? Even if what you say is actually sometimes forceful, but purely political criticism of the government's action. And of course, anti-Semitism is something that we can link to hate speech. In the very same country, in the past few weeks, elected officials and political campaigners were physically assaulted in the streets because of their ideas, beliefs, because of their political affiliation, and so on. And in Quebec, in the past months, I don't know how many elected officials, especially at the municipal level, decided to resign, very often women, because they cannot cope with harassment and threats any longer. So that's where we are now with regard to the state of public discourse and how our freedom to express ourselves is being used right now. Okay, so given that contested nature of that basic freedom that we have to express ourselves as we see fit, some are saying that, well, okay, so freedom of expression is too often contested, challenged, restricted, and so on. So some are saying, well, we should, have much more robust protection of freedom of speech. Some claim to be absolutist about free speech, right? And on the other side, others are saying, well, no, we need stricter regulation, right? Because of events such as those that I mentioned, that we need stricter regulation, stricter limits to freedom of speech. So, unsurprisingly, given that I teach philosophy, I think that we need to go back to what's the as a basic principle, what's the meaning of freedom of expression? Why is it that we value it, that we consider it as a basic freedom, but also what could be the very basic reasons why we would want to regulate it and limit it in some circumstances. So that's what I want to do in my remarks. It seems to me that liberalism in particular as a political philosophy is confronted with what I called an uncomfortable predicament with regard to free speech. So on the one hand, liberalism is committed to our basic rights and freedoms, and such rights and freedoms are supposed to track our very basic interests that we have as human beings, and the capacity, the possibility to express ourselves as we see fit is one of these basic interests that we have for different reasons. It's related to the possibility, to express important aspects of our identity, some of our deepest convictions, moral, spiritual, philosophical, political, and so on, right? And we all have a basic interest to have that freedom to express important aspects of our identity. But we also have good reasons to think that freedom of expression, not only because we can express ourselves as we want, but also because we have an interest in others' capacity to express themselves as they see fit as well. And that was one of John Stuart Mill's most fundamental arguments in favor of his very generous conception of freedom of expression, right? So Mill pointed out that we're all quite fallible, right? When we try to make sense of, reality, to understand what's going on, to make up our mind on different issues, form beliefs and opinions, we're very fallible, right? We get things wrong sometimes, and when we get things right, we often depend on many others, right? Either the media or other person who have beliefs, knowledge, arguments, and so on. So as he rightly pointed out, we need to have access to what others, want to share. And even when we disagree, even when we think that they are wrong, that their views are wrong-headed, and so on, Mill pointed out that, just figuring out why others are wrong, if that's the case, that's already beneficial for us because we have a clearer sense of what the truth is or what are the best arguments in favor of our own view. So sometimes we'll change our mind because of what people expressed, or we'll see the world differently if it's like artworks and so on. Or sometimes we'll just hold on to our position but have a better understanding of why we were right. So we also have an interest in others having that very basic liberty. And collectively also, and maybe I will sound a bit idealistic here, but collectively we have to make very important decisions on complex matters. And we think that we can all wish that our collective decision-making would be based on more inclusive and enlightened deliberations among us, among people holding different views who can express themselves freely, right? So I think that, these aspects, even briefly stated, show how important is that very basic freedom. Maintenant, même si y a des restrictions souvent à la liberté d'expression qui sont imposées, parfois de façon injustifiée, je ne pense pas que personne défend véritablement une position absolutiste par rapport à la liberté d'expression, c'est-à-dire qui serait une liberté sans limite. Même un grand défenseur d'un point de vue philosophique comme John Stuart Mill aussi ajouté à son plaidoyer l'idée que il y a quand même un principe de non-préjudice à autrui qui doit limiter la liberté d'expression et les autres libertés individuelles des citoyens. Hein. C'est le harm principle. Au moins de façon minimale, hein, tout ce qui est incitation à la violence, hein, par exemple, hein, de s'en prendre physiquement à quelqu'un pour ses idées, ça devrait être interdit. Hein. Ce n'est pas autorisé par la liberté d'expression, même à la lumière d'une conception très généreuse de la liberté d'expression. Mais je pense que Mill n'a pas été assez loin parce que son principe de non-préjudice à autrui, hein, c'est vraiment les incitations à la violence hein, que ça proscrit. Et il y a des discours, des actes de parole qui peuvent aussi porter atteinte hein, à la dignité et aux droits d'autrui, même s'ils n'engendrent pas de la violence physique. Et je pense là aux discours haineux, hein, aux discours de haine, qui sont les discours hein, qui, disons, qui manifestent hein, l'aversion la plus forte par rapport à certains groupes hein, au sein de la population. Donc les discours qui vilifient, qui dénigrent hein, de façon très, très forte, qui déshumanisent certaines personnes en raison de certains de leurs traits identitaires. Ces discours devraient, étant donné les torts qu'ils créent, devraient aussi être vus comme une limite à la liberté d'expression. Et c'est effectivement le cas dans la plupart des démocraties constitutionnelles. Et les États-Unis sont plutôt l'exception que la règle, en n'interdisant pas les discours haineux. Donc, je pense que même si plusieurs disent qu'il faut défendre de façon beaucoup plus absolue et intégrale la liberté d'expression, la plupart reconnaissent qu'il doit y avoir des limites au moins pour proscrire aussi les discours haineux. Disons, le sort inconfortable du libéralisme, là, c'est que même si on admet qu'il y a ses limites, pas d'incitation à la violence physique, pas d'incitation à la haine, des discours qui déshumanisent et qui contestent le statut d'égaux de certains de nos concitoyens. Il y a toute une série de discours, d'actes de parole qui n'atteignent pas cette intensité que représentent les discours haineux, mais qui sont quand même aussi des discours qui ont pour effet de stigmatiser certains groupes de citoyens. Et là, la crainte de certains, c'est que si on interdit les discours haineux, qu'à un certain moment, on va avoir une conception trop large des discours haineux et que ça va inclure des discours qui devraient être tolérés dans une société pluraliste et démocratique. Donc, des discours qui peuvent être vus comme étant blessants, qui peuvent être vus comme étant offensants, injurieux et ainsi de suite. Là, je pense qu'effectivement, un de nos défis, c'est d'être capable de délimiter ce qui appartient véritablement au discours haineux et les distinguer d'autres discours qu'on peut juger comme étant désagréables ou offensants, mais qui n'atteignent pas ce seuil-là que représente vraiment le discours de haine. Et il faut aussi apprendre à tolérer des discours qu'on juge inappropriés ou blessants. Et ça fait partie, je pense, d'un de nos défis présentement dans le type de société dans lequel on vit présentement. Donc, de tolérer des discours qu'on juge offensants, mais qui ne sont pas des discours proprement haineux. Je termine, j'ai déjà dépassé mes 10 minutes en disant que cela étant dit, en ayant cartographié la situation de cette façon-là, une de mes préoccupations est que il y a des figures publiques influentes qui exploitent, disons, l'espèce de zone grise entre les discours de haine et les discours blessants, mais qui ne sont pas tout à fait haineux. Je pense par exemple à un Geert Wilders aux Pays-Bas qui demande à une foule « Est-ce qu'il y a trop de Marocains ici aux Pays-Bas » Ce n'est pas un discours directement haineux, mais on sait très bien quelles sont les attitudes qu'il veut générer chez les citoyens qui l'écoutent. Lorsqu'un Zemmour en France dit « Ah oui, mais il y a des prénoms là, qui ne sont pas français vraiment et que ce sont des personnes qui s'auto-excluent de la société », ce n'est pas un discours directement haineux, mais qui attise quand même certains préjugés que peuvent avoir certains des citoyens français. Donc, c'est très difficile de bien réguler le discours. Il y a ces zones grises. Le droit a son rôle à jouer en établissant des limites juridiques à la liberté d'expression. Mais il y a toute une part qui ne peut pas relever du droit et qui doit relever de la discussion collective, qui doit relever de contre-discours. Il faut contester ce genre de discours des Wilders et Zemmour et ainsi de suite, mais sans qu'on puisse bénéficier véritablement de l'appui du droit. Donc, c'est un terrain qui est compliqué, qui est complexe à naviguer, mais on peut... lorsqu'on comprend le sens des principes, lorsqu'on comprend ce qu'on peut faire avec le droit et ce qu'on ne peut pas faire avec le droit, on comprend mieux comment on peut en arriver collectivement à une régulation, disons, sage et éclairée du discours, mais ça reste un défi colossal pour les sociétés comme les nôtres. Merci.
But before I go to you, Alexie, I'm going to try something, and I think you're going to... Yes, that means the app is working. I'm going to try to do something because of the technology situation, which is, and I'm going to do the same with you, which is I'm going to ask a follow-up question to Jocelyn that's going to serve both as a follow-up question and as an opportunity to repeat in English some of the things he said in French. You see what I'm saying? See what I'm doing? Because Jocelyn, here's my question. You just spoke about how uncomfortable it can be for liberal philosophers to discuss the limits of freedom of expression. And I think there's something very meta about that, because what you're actually talking about is how freedom of expression is uncomfortable in and of itself. So it's both uncomfortable for liberal philosophers, but it's just uncomfortable in general. You're trying to make this distinction between, I guess, the hurtful speech and hate speech, and how, I guess the question would be, if hate speech make people unsafe, then how do we use this notion of safety to draw that line between hurtful speech and hate speech? And should hate speech then be defined with its consequences rather than with the intent?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Emilie. That's a very good, not only a restatement, but a very good question as well. So
multitasking.
Yeah, so hate speech is at kind of at the end of a spectrum or a continuum, right? With regards to speech that targets some group within the population and that express very strong aversion of that group. And yes, it should be prohibited because of its consequences, right? So either it can lead others, right, to go, up the ante and physically, attack the target of hate speech, or it can lead to other form of harm, such as discrimination, exclusions, and for the target, as a legal philosopher, Jeremy Waldron, puts it, once you're aware that you're the target of hate speech, the stakes change for the target, right? Because now all of a sudden you realize, okay, so maybe I'm not seen as an equal in this society. Maybe I'm seen as a threat. I don't enjoy the same moral status, like equal moral status as other citizen, and I'm not welcome here. So the stakes change in that sense, and so there can be like psychological harm and social harm and so on. So that's why it should be prohibited. But yeah, you're right. So the distinction is between hateful speech and hurtful speech, and hurtful speech is a broader category that includes hate speech, but that includes other speech that can hurt, but that are not properly hateful, and that should probably be tolerated. But I think that the uncomfortable predicament is that they can still create harm, right? They can still harm in the kind of examples that I gave, where still the equal social status of the members of that group is still a challenge, and that can lead to different forms of marginalization. But I guess that we reach the limit of what we can do with the law there, and we have to find other means to challenge these discourses, to fight against them. But I guess that many of my colleagues who push back against the idea that anti-hate speech laws are legitimate, they always say, well, what we need is more speech, right? Counter speech to these exclusionary discourses. And I say, well, that's not enough for hate speech, but I think that they're right with regard to other kinds of hurtful speech where we have to speak back,
right.
Basically.
Thank you for that. Alexie?
Well, thank you very much. Unlike Jocelyn, n'est rien sans son bord. I'm nothing without my notes. Thanks so much for being here today. As soon as this thing was shared, I reached out to Sheila saying, I would like to do this. Why? Because I came from a system where in the 1990s, you were targeted because you were reading a specific newspaper. My professors were sent to jail for a few weeks because I held a conference discussing issues of democracy. And when this came, I was like, this seems like something familiar to me. So thanks for being here. Merci d'être là ce soir. Nous devons entendre cette question fondamentale, à savoir la liberté d'expression. Mais comment comprendre ce concept qui peut paraître aussi simple? Dans quelle mesure le sujet est-il libre? Mais surtout, dans quel cadre juridique, citoyen et moraux peut-elle et doit-elle s'exercer la question de la liberté d'expression? Ce sont ces questions centrales qui ont été débattues par des philosophes, sociologues et juristes. Voici comment je perçois la question de la liberté d'expression. C'est pour moi la possibilité garantie aux citoyens d'exprimer librement, sans être inquiétés, leurs opinions et dans le respect de la dignité d'autrui et conformément à la loi. Donc, à plusieurs égards, s'engager pour la liberté d'expression, c'est s'opposer à la censure, s'engager pour la démocratie. Donc, à partir d'une telle formulation, il devient évident que toute interprétation de la question de la liberté peut être saisie à partir de deux considérations. D'une part, les personnes qui se battent pour exercer ce droit sont en danger pour leur existence. Et vous savez certainement, dans de nombreux systèmes autoritaires d'Afrique, et jusqu'à récemment en Roumanie, et même en Arabie Saoudite ou en Russie, penser et surtout parler est dangereux. Des écrivains en Afrique ont perdu leur vie parce qu'ils ont parlé. Je ne vous rappellerai pas les tragédies de Charlie Hebdo et les autres. D'autre part, dans les pays où se déploient les pratiques démocratiques moins contraignantes, certains citoyens se battent pour le droit de tout dire en toutes circonstances. Au Canada, l'arrêt Mike Wise, n'est-ce pas, rendu par la Cour suprême, a conclu que l'humoriste, n'est-ce pas, qui s'était moqué de Jérémy Gabriel, l'avait fait pas à cause de son handicap, mais parce qu'il était une personnalité publique. Beaucoup ont estimé que la Cour suprême a renforcé ce qu'on considère comme étant la liberté artistique. Aux États-Unis, Jocelyn l'a dit tout à l'heure, les discours de haine ne sont pas illégaux, c'est permis par ce qu'ils appellent le premier amendement. Donc, face donc à ces tensions, n'est-ce pas, entre le légal et le moral, comment coordonner la question de la liberté dite d'expression? Nous savons sans doute, n'est-ce pas, la parole est action, et on se souvient du livre, n'est-ce pas, Quand dire c'est faire de Austin. Pour ceux qui ont lu la Bible, n'est-ce pas, on sait que dans Genèse, la première action se fait par la parole. Dans certaines cultures, y compris la mienne, on peut bénir ou maudire à partir de la parole. Donc, de là, il est question, on peut se demander, avec ces dynamiques entre le légal et l'éthique ou le moral, n'est-ce pas, comment construire cette barrière-là? Donc, ce sont ces questions, n'est-ce pas, de mon point de vue assez terribles dans leur prérogative, que je vais essayer d'aborder en discutant brièvement des questions de sphère publique, la politique et les médias. Et je terminerai par un coup de réflexion sur les discours de haine, n'est-ce pas, déjà abordé très rapidement par Jocelyn. I will just discuss public sphere very briefly. Public sphere, what I call the three P's of free speech. Apart from legal provisions, it is critical, in my opinion, to consider the notion of public sphere to understand the reality of free speech, or the practice of it. Habermas developed the notion of public sphere as the gathering of individuals to discuss and debate issues of authority, governance, and exchange goods and services. Today, newspapers, magazines, radios, television, and the internet and social media are all part of what we call the public sphere. While they can, in fact, indoctrinate, media can also liberate and educate people. This is where I would like to elaborate on what I call the three P's of free speech: politicians, the press, and the population. Politicians play a key role in establishing, in my view, parameters that define speech or the absence of it. In autocracy, censorship is normalized, and I speak to you about what I went through when I was at the university. However, it would be an illusion to think that in what is referred to as Western democracies, things are much, much better. McCarthyism in the US, their obsession with communism was in many respects an attack on speech. After 9/11, you recall George Bush's Patriot Act that made citizens really vulnerable. Nicolas will relate to this. In many political parties, you are bound by what we call party lines. The press also plays a key role in this because while the press plays a role has a role of entertaining people, they also have an important role, that is to educate. But by determining what is newsworthy, journalists not only shape public opinion, but also have the responsibility to determine what can make a society more cohesive and more inclusive. We know the role played by media in Rwanda, just to mention the case, 1994 case. I'm not going back to the world wars. Now, population are the other group, which are no more, quote unquote, passive consumers of news. They're self-informed, but more importantly, they also generate information. Whether it's legitimate or not, that's another question. Now, this has led into what is called citizen journalism, by which many people arrogate themselves the right to produce content which may be verified or not. I will end very quickly by discussing the role of free speech and hate speech and discuss how this can play out at the university level. Maybe I should have started by this, by defining what is called the hate speech. According to the United Nations, I will quote in French, le discours de haine, c'est tout type de communication, orale ou écrite, ou de comportement constituant une atteinte ou utilisant un langage péjoratif ou discriminatoire à l'égard d'une personne ou d'un groupe en raison de leur identité, en d'autres termes, de l'appartenance religieuse, de l'origine ethnique, de la nationalité, de la race, de la couleur de la peau, de l'ascendance, du genre ou d'autres facteurs constitutifs de l'identité. Au Canada, un projet de loi veut mieux définir les discours haineux dans la loi canadienne sur les droits de la personne et permettre aux personnes seules et aux groupes de déposer des plaintes à la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne contre des gens qui publient des discours haineux en ligne. Il définit le discours haineux comme le contenu d'une communication qui exprime de la détestation, Jocelyn l'a dit, ou de l'aversion envers une personne ou un groupe de personnes en se fondant sur un motif de distinction illicite. Évidemment, on a parlé des émaux en France, ils sont nombreux ici au Canada et ailleurs, et en Allemagne également. J'ai parlé de l'arrêt Mike Ward, et surtout du premier amendement aux États-Unis, je l'ai noté. Ceci montre que ce qui est moralement ou éthiquement discutable peut être légal. La question brûlante, souvent inutilement polémique, c'est de savoir quelle est la frontière, n'est-ce pas, entre les discours de la haine et la liberté d'expression. Beaucoup d'universités canadiennes ont des codes et des paramètres clairs sur ce qui constitue pour eux la liberté d'expression, Certaines personnes, souvent des extrémistes de tous bords, prétextent la liberté d'expression pour justifier des discours problématiques. Je préfère le signaler dès longtemps, la liberté d'expression n'est pas la liberté de haïr ou de honnir gratuitement des citoyens du fait de leur identité ou bien de leurs opinions. Pour réfléchir à cette question, je vais juste convoquer le livre Free Speech on Campus de Erwin Chemerinsky et Howard Gilman, ainsi que de Harm in Hate Speech de Jeremy Walton. Ces auteurs estiment, et je suis d'accord avec eux, qu'il y a des raisons de limiter la liberté d'expression. On aura un débat là-dessus avec les juristes. Celle-ci a souvent été utilisée pour moquer, dénigrer et attaquer les citoyens dans leur dignité. Voilà pourquoi il note à juste titre qu'il existe une tension entre ce que j'estime légitime, entre la liberté d'expression et d'autres valeurs comme la sécurité nationale, la sécurité, la moralité publique, qui est un concept problématique, n'est-ce pas, la vie privée, la réputation, la dignité et l'égalité. Une question centrale que posent Chemerinsky et Gilman est celle-ci. Si l'université est le lieu où on peut et doit débattre de tout, qu'en est-il alors des dérisions, préjugés, stéréotypes et offenses sur le sexe, la race, etc. Comment approcher la question sensible, n'est-ce pas, mais frontale sur le discours de haine en général? Il nous rappelle que dans les années 90, plus de 350 universités américaines ont entrepris de formaliser la restriction sur les discours de haine. Malheureusement, ça a été jugé anticonstitutionnelle, justement en version du First Amendment. Comment donc favoriser à l'université un apprentissage inclusif dans un contexte où vous pouvez être raillé, moqué à cause de votre identité? Il faut dire qu'aux États-Unis, avec son premier amendement, ce pays, la plupart des nations démocratiques interdisent les discours haineux. Et dans les pays sérieux, n'est-ce pas, on applique avec sévérité, n'est-ce pas, des dispositions légales. Dans son livre The Harm in Hate Speech, Waldron explique pourquoi il est impératif de réguler les discours de haine, surtout à l'université. Je suis d'accord avec lui. Il donne 4 raisons. 1. Les dégâts et la violence psychologique infligés aux victimes sont souvent irréparables. 2. Les discours de haine sont un affront à la dignité des personnes qui y sont exposées. 3. Ces discours sont une forme imbécile pour moi de discrimination. Et enfin 4. Les discours de haine sont aussi une offense à la loi et méritent d'être punis. Donc, dans un contexte où les libertés se font concurrence, il est peut-être utile, n'est-ce pas, de s'en référer à ce que Sigal Benpora appelle liberté inclusive freedom. In her book, Free Speech on Campus, Benpora establishes what she calls inclusive freedom as a framework that can operate in all contexts. In advancing freedom of expression on campus, she develops the notion of inclusive freedom and makes recommendations in ways in which that can help avoid polarization between the right and left colleagues on campus. For her, it is essential to allow free speech for all stakeholders, but in the meantime also recognizing the demands of vulnerable groups, the issue of diversity on campus, avoiding harm as well as diversifying curricula. Pour conclure, je dirais que la liberté d'expression, comme toutes les formes de liberté, reste une conquête permanente. Toutefois, les vies ne se valent pas, et certainement à cause du sinistre concept de mort kilométrique, les médias canadiens font très peu de cas de ce qui se passe ailleurs dans le monde, y compris dans les pays dont sont originaires certains des citoyens. Dans de nombreux pays, les journalistes restent assassinés, les enseignants d'université ou des écrivains traqués par leurs propres collègues ou par la police. Thank you.
I'm going to do the same thing before putting you two in conversation. Alexie, the first thing you did in your remarks, which I found really interesting, is you gave one of the most concise definition of freedom of expression that I've heard, which is as the possibility to express one's opinion, one without being harassed, inquiété, you said, or harmed, and two, respectfully, with respect of others. And so what you have in that definition is the definition of freedom of expression that is both, one, it needs to be safe for you, and it needs to be safe for others. That's a very, very concise way of taking the concept as freedom of expression should be safe for you and safe for others. Most of both of your thoughts has been focused on hate speech, so the part that is unsafe for others. But I'd like to hear you develop a little bit more, because you gave some examples as well of speech that is unsafe for the person speaking. And you ended with talking about harm to journalists, harm to people speaking. You started with an anecdote about a professor that's been to prison for reading the wrong newspaper. Even Massey in this space has been hosting journalists or writers that are endangered all around the world for what they're saying. I'd like to have a sense of that part of the limits to freedom of expression, which is often really, really hard to define legally because a lot of it is just self-censorship. So you cannot punish or have a sense of the speech that is not happening, which makes that part even harder to define. Sometimes I feel insist on the hate speech because that's speech that happens, right? When the harm to other happens, we see it. But the harm to the self, a lot of time, that's just silence and censorship, so we don't see it as much. How do we make that part more visible?
Well, thanks, Emily. That's actually very challenging. I'll share examples based on some of the part of the world you may not be very familiar with. In Cameroon, in January 2023, a journalist was murdered. It's shit going on Martinez ago. It's all over the place. And he had a very popular talk show during which he was decrying corruption and what have not. So that's one example of the ways in which people are still exposed. And this is happening in a context within which you would assume that people or the police of the country has become a little more civilized. That's one example. Coming back to that, I can take one or two other examples where you have writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's been living in exile for over many years. Mongo Betty stayed in France for over 30 years before coming to Cameroon in 1992. Students were still hiding to read some newspapers. In the case of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he wrote a book, and the police even came to search for a person they didn't know that was actually a character. So these are issues that most countries grapple with, and which shows, as I said, that freedom of expression is still a process. But my struggle here is, as I said in my talk, how do we manage this? How do we make sure, and also, maybe I'll finish with that, there are also issues where in some areas, Jocelyn mentioned the difference between hurtful speech and hate speech, but the interesting thing is hate speech is hurtful, necessarily. But how do we draw that boundary? One quick thing is, when I came to the university, my first year, this is something a little hard to hear. From my last name, a roommate who was 3 years ahead of me told me, if you are in a room, this is actually making me shiver. If you are in a room with somebody from this ethnic group and you find a snake, you kill this person first. And I was 20.
Wow.
And you hear this. I'm just new to the university. So this is how serious hate, was it hate speech? I don't know. Was stereotype? But these are some of the things people struggle with, and many people get away with it. So I may not have a right answer for you, but it is, as I said, a tension between what is legal and what is ethical, and in a specific context, at times, even when it's illegal, people get away with it. That's why you see people like Eric Zemmour they can afford to be candidates, to be successful politicians, So I may not answer your question, but you see where I come from.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can follow up with a question maybe directed at you, Jocelyn, but you can feel free to jump in as well. Because now we've spoken about danger to the self, danger to others. I want to speak about, you both were speaking to hate speech targeting individuals versus targeting groups. And I think that's also really important to unpack. For those who may not know me, I grew up in Quebec City. And Quebec City was actually at the center of defining that issue in Canada, in the sense that we had this hateful trash radio host that dominated our airwaves for, 30 years, André Arthur. And he, at some point, called a lot of people names. And then he also started to say a lot of racist things about groups. And there was this case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, where he was basically being racist against black taxi drivers. And that became the precedent for basically a Supreme Court judgment that is about When you attack groups in the radio, it is sort of fine and maybe not hate speech, but be really, really careful with libel of individuals. And so there is this basically double system where libel law protects the reputation of individuals, but they're not, groups are not protected to the same level. The reputation of groups is not protected in Canada in the same way that the reputation of individuals are. And I like, Jocelyn also, lived in Quebec City for a long time, but I think it's a question for all Canadians, this issue of when individuals are protected as individuals but not as part of a group, you end up with the individuals being more protected, being the people who are not part of a group that is targeted, right? It's much harder. You cannot label women, but you can label a single woman. And so how do we take of the limitation to free speech between how much more it is limited clearly in our legal system when you attack an individual, but not when you attack a group, and how that leaves marginalized groups more vulnerable than individual personalities, and that double standards that we have in our legal system.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that you're right. It cannot only be focused on actual individuals, like persons that are targeted, but hate speech laws should also protect groups. And one of the reasons is that even if there's hate speech, that targets all Muslims or all blacks or all homosexuals and so on. To go back to what I said, building on Jeremy Waldron's, what that kind of generic slogans or messages do is that they reduce what he calls inclusivity, but that could be cast as the kind of the basic assurance that you have that you will be treated as an equal in that society, that you have the same rights as others, and that you will not be subjected to forms of exclusion and marginalization and so on. So it doesn't have to target a specific individual to reduce that kind of basic public good that we have, that to live in an inclusive society. And if you allow for these messages in the public sphere, that reduces that kind of collective good there, where everyone can feel as an equal member of the society. So I think that these generic hateful speech need to be also forbidden, even if they don't target specific individuals. And if they do, then there's defamation and maybe there's other legal ground. But I should note that we have Richard Moon here with us, who's one of our foremost legal scholar on freedom of expression. So I hope that you'll jump in at some point, Dick. So I think that it should also protect members of groups, even if individuals are not targeted. And I have to say that I tried my best to repress that memory of that radio host that polluted the public sphere in Quebec City for so many years.
Well, not while I'm around.
Yeah.
Alexie, I want to target my next question to you, but also feel free, Jocelyn. And then I'm going to open it to the room because there's been a lot of nods and things, and I think I want to hear from you guys as well. I remember very clearly an article in The Atlantic a couple of years ago from Ta-Nehisi Coates, and just the title was so interesting. Not everything Ta-Nehisi Coates says is gold, but in that one, just the title really stayed with me. He was talking about Kanye West, and he said, Kanye West wants freedom, white freedom. And that's the title. And what he meant by that, and the whole piece was basically an essay on what freedom means in American society, and how freedom of expression is, because of the colonial and violent and racist history of the United States, freedom of expression in the United States cannot be understood separately from freedom of oppression. And so there's that piece, the notion of freedom of expression as freedom of oppression, and the way that it's understood in certain political tradition. And also, I'm thinking of so many conversations I had with different indigenous philosophers, indigenous elders who've been, when reacting to this debate about freedom of expression, independently across the country, many people have been saying the same things, which is, why is it that you're only talking about freedom of expression and not responsibility of oppression, of expression? What is this, obsession with only freedom and not responsibility coming from? That's very foreign. And so the question would be, is it even perhaps a mistake to talk about, to have this issue framed only as an issue of freedom of expression, rather than also an issue of ethics of expression? And if we understood it maybe as ethics of expression, then maybe we understand better the oppression part and the limits of it. Why is it that freedom is the key word there and not something more encompassing?
Oh, thank you. I would say you should be not grateful, but happy that that talk show is over and that person may not be speaking anymore. In many places in the world, that still happens.
Right.
In many countries where people are called names, communities are called names. And it's also interesting that when you talk about freedom of expression, it's as if the community, the group that has to be melted into the individual to be able to protect themselves. So it's kind of a very interesting tension. And you're quite right when you say that there seems to be a focus on the freedom, but not with what comes with it, which is the responsibility, And the US is a case in point, where I can literally call you anything and claim my First Amendment. So, and this is where I'm often very careful. We should be very careful when we compare issues around the world, because while the US may be considered a democratic society, but some of the things that happen there are just, especially this First Amendment, it's very appalling. It's not different from cases where people can be murdered because they spoke, and this will come with no consequences, So again, this may raise more questions than answers, but as I said in my conversation, I think freedom of expression, like any kind of freedom, it's a continuous battle that calls upon everybody, every community, each person to contribute to, because it's not going to be resolved like overnight. And fortunately or unfortunately, we're in a stage where media and technological transformation have made it possible for people to just do anything, anywhere, by the privilege of just hiding behind a keyboard.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Jocelyn, I'd like to hear from you as well, because you were just talking in your speech about the limitation of liberal philosophy, how comfortable it is when you're coming from that training to be thinking about this issue. And I think my questions also speaks to the limits of that and how we need to perhaps have as a complement other ways of seeing the world and other philosophical tradition as a way to complement that tradition to better understand freedom of expression, ethics of expression, responsibility of expression.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, I think that it's mostly for the liberal state that it's uncomfortable, whereas liberal philosophers, they should feel comfortable tackling a difficult issue, but it's
they
difficult.
Should, yes.
Yes, they should. It's difficult because of their commitment to basic individual freedoms, but also their joint commitment to the equality of all citizens and their interest in creating the conditions of mutual respect within a society. And it's very difficult to reconcile both. But no, I think that your questions is right on. I think that there's a limit to what we can accomplish via legal prohibition. So freedom of expression, but it's no different than any of our other basic freedoms, right? Freedom of conscience and religion, freedom to assemble and organize and protest and so on. These are all basic freedom, but they should be exercised with some ethical discernment and sensitivity toward the consequences of how we exercise our basic rights. And yeah, so in my own work, I plead for what I call an ethics of concern for the other when we exercise our freedom of expression, okay? And I think that we should all do that, but still, I don't want the state to try to, enforce ethics or virtues in particular, right? That would be very difficult and a slippery slope. So we should promote some civic virtues, including the ethically wise and respectful uses of our freedom of expression, but that cannot be through legal enforcement, right? So that's why I'm alluding to other means, but it's very frustrating. Very often we're not successful, as we sadly know in Quebec. Yes, I think that's how we should always have that kind of ethical sensitivity when we use our freedom of expression, because words can hurt. Yeah, there's a limit to what we can do via, legal enforcement.
That makes a lot of sense.
Il y a des utopies dans ta démarche, mais c'est bien.
Ouais.
That's right. That's right. I see a lot of nodding. First of all, before we get to the
Well, that's a difficult one, but I really appreciate your saying. In fact, we're talking about care. You have to care for the other person. C'est très concret. Think about it. What will be the consequences? While the legal framework will not be enough, but I think it's necessary, if not indispensable. I think if we all know that there are consequences for what we do, we'll probably care more. I mean, you have to obey the law, even if you don't believe in it. So I think once you have that framework, that's one aspect. Second, again, this is where we as a community, we can help, as scholars, as teachers, and really as media people. They can go a long way in liberating people, sorry to say this, from evil thoughts. Media, or I would even say the church, sorry about this, but it happens that I was telling a colleague that in my home country, Cameroon, the day the church decides that we need to clean this regime, that's going to happen overnight, because people listen to them. There is a symbolic force within these people that can help. I mean, they have this moral authority and this influence that can help move things together. So, pass it on to you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the difficult question also. Yeah.
Matter of fact, diversity, in many respects, enriches people. So once we understand that, we can move forward, I think, as a society. And I remember this poster where it says, well, love doesn't hurt. One Archbishop said, there is no harm in doing good. So be good to yourself, you'll be good to people. Anyway, sorry.
No worries. No worries. There's a lot of other questions. Before we go to them, I just might want to share something, maybe step down for a minute at my role as a moderator to just, because you're talking about people self-censoring in the public sphere, and my job is to speak. And I just want to state that the comment I hear the most from young racialized people that love my columns is, I don't know how you do it. And that is meant as a compliment, but it means they would not do it. And that for me is the indication of them shutting up. It used that 10 years ago, a lot of people were just in activism circles were fighting for who's gonna get the more light. Now it's like nobody wants to do nobody wants to go because it's become so dangerous. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how decades ago, you used to have more like those messiah, those very charismatic leaders that would speak for entire movements. You don't have that in organizing anymore because it's too dangerous. All those people got shot. So if you don't want to die in your 30s, you learn to spread how you speak around so that it's not just one person embodying the message. And when I see people actually getting over that self-censorship, it's because there's coordinized speech in a way that makes it less easy to kill the messenger as a way to kill the message. Because there's so many different messengers that are there at the same time, that gives, like, courage is contagious. And so when you have collective speech rather than focusing on an individual speech as a space, in relation to our conversation that we haven't really spoken about, and two, like that students as students plural, right? One student leader that has emerged from any of this, I don't think that's an accident. So like the students as a collective having a certain position on freedom of speech rather than one person exercising their rights.
Well, parlant de ça, je vais y aller rapidement. I think common, I think there's one or two things there. In most places, universities happen to be in urban settings. So that alone creates the conditions for encampment to happen. It's no accident that, I don't know, for Toronto, for example, there will not be encampment, it's say, I don't know, Ontario Tech, for example. That's too remote. What we experience here, I think is convenience is one of them. So I think that's my reading of it. I may be wrong, but that's my reading of it. The second is, yes, as I said, universities is a space where you can debate any and everything. The challenge is, how do you do that? Can you do that respecting yourself, respecting the space, but also respecting others? And this is where I relate to Jocelyn's concept. Sorry, but I prefer to use my own word, care. Can we do that while respecting, making sure that A, we don't hurt, B, it doesn't end into hate. So I personally believe that there is nothing that doesn't deserve to be discussed. And if we don't say that at the university, where else will we do that? Talking about censorship, for example, at times I wonder, this is actually even very daring. Like, I wonder if it's actually not even better, not better per se, but is it worth letting that hate come out so that you can educate this person, if this person is educatable? I don't have any answer to that, but again, these are some tensions I think about. Back to the incumbent, yes, I think location, opportunity, and really the way in which we express ourselves matters. And my colleague and friend Pamela knows this very well. This is not only about students. As a professor, as a chair, we've all witnessed that as colleagues, we can rage over emails for the most simple things, not knowing that we are hurting people. For some basic things. So, again, I prefer to pass it to you. So, I don't know.
It's a very good answer. I don't have much. Hi, Pam, it's nice to see you. It's a very good answer. Yeah, and it shows that embodied relationships, including political action, is irreplaceable, right? So yes, you add another layer where you can organize online and so on, but you cannot replace in-person embodied relationships. And yeah, I agree with Alexie. Basically, at the university, academic freedom, I defended that it's different than freedom of expression. Of course, there's some overlap, but it's not just the application of freedom of expression, at the university. it comes with other norms and rules that are properly academic, but surely that's the place where you learn about ideas, you debate ideas, and then you want to apply them to society and to politics. And yeah, we should be as tolerant as possible, when students want to express political convictions and protest, ask for changes, especially at that stage in their life. That said, as we said earlier, when you actually protest and you're build like camps and so on, you're using your freedom of expression and your freedom to assemble and to protest and so on, and that comes with other also restrictions, and you need to impacts and so on. But yeah, we should be as tolerant as possible with regard to that form of political expression.
Right here, one back there, two back there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Michael Byers, je suis professeur à l'Université de Colombie-Britannique. My wife and I have a son who is an undergraduate student at a major university in the United States, who is participating in the protest there. So this is not a hypothetical I'm putting before you. Our son is anti-war. Our son is opposed to the prime ministership of Benjamin Netanyahu. Our son is pro-human rights for everyone. He is most definitely not anti-Semitic, nor indeed anti-Israeli. But he feels very strongly about expressing his opposition to the war in Gaza. There is an opportunity on his university campus to gather with thousands of other students to show through his presence his views. There are people at the protest who have the megaphone, who are saying hateful things. Does he leave? There are people, a few people, who have signs that constitute evidence of hate speech. Does he leave? The dilemma I'm putting before you is that if we crack down too hard on some instance of hate speech, we may be denying the freedom of expression of many more people. This is an incredibly complex topic. I don't have an opinion on this yet. I've been struggling with this. I celebrate the fact that so many young people are showing their concern. And at the same time, I don't want people saying very hateful, harmful, dangerous things. And so the balance is, in some respect, between the collective voice and the individual harm. And I just wanted to put that into the picture also. I'm really pleased that Canadian universities have shown restraint and have managed so far to find some balance. And I celebrate the fact that my students in Vancouver are also out protesting. So, but I want to introduce this. How do we stop the person with the megaphone calling for a genocide of Jews,
Right.
while not telling the 1,000 students that they have to go home?
Really important question.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that story. And it is a very difficult situation, and I'm sure that it's something that is quite standard for all those who are in militant groups or try to organize and so on. The hope would be that a substantial number of reasonable protesters would try to discuss it over with those who are clearly anti-Semitic and inciting hate and violence, and that they would be able to reason them, but sadly sometimes it's not possible. And I suppose that I would want to dissociate with them without, stopping the protest and so on, saying, but I don't want to have anything to do with this, but there are other reasons why we should protest, and there are other ways to do it and so on. And at some point, those who are, preferring these messages and so on should, live up to the consequences of their own action. But I agree with you basically that we shouldn't disqualify the entire movement on the basis of some, more radical fringes.
I think, this is very, as Sheila mentioned it, when we agreed to this, the world wasn't what it is.
It wasn't great though.
But that's it. We still think that is. But it's one of those cases that are really troubling. But that said, I think we should always remember that universities have always historically been the places where change happens. This is where change starts. In 1968 in France, it was all university as well. 1964, the Vietnam War that was fought in the US. University played a big role, a major role in this. In the case of US and many others, well, unfortunately, I would say, it's happening in the US, where this is legal. But is it ethical? That's a big other problem. That's why in my conversation I was wondering, how do we draw, is anything that is legal ethical? So, and that, your son and many others are facing this conundrum where they have, people are literally allowed to say any and everything, So it's very difficult. And you mentioned Germany, where now the law is literally criminalizing some people just for speaking out. So I think once, and that's why I said in my intervention earlier that the legal framework may not be enough, but once we have it, I really believe in those. If they cross that line that is defined by the law, I think the law should be applied. But it happens that it's not the case in the US. They're not breaking any law. So now back to the student, how do we make sure that they protest differently? I think that would counter, in my opinion, I think, to how students organize themselves. Because if you organize yourself, you don't make sure that there's no other person that blurs your message. As my mother used to tell me, don't behave or react in such a way that they will forget that what somebody else did, but focus on what you did and said. So in this instance, is what's happening, that you plan, you protest against something, we have 1, 2, or 3 people who will do one thing that's going to almost erase what we're fighting for. So I would think it comes down to how our young compatriots, these students organize themselves and prevent these very few from bringing on something that's totally different from what they are focusing on.
Before we go to the next question, Jocelyn and I we met each other back in 2013 during what we call the Charter of Quebec Values debate, which became the ancestor of the Bill 21 debate. And we had that same problem back then when I was an organizer, and there was a lot of allies within the university system with that, where you had this one very egregious imam in Montreal that is always the troublemaker in every social movement, and who wants to basically take leadership of everything that happens as a way to grow his base. And the way we dealt with him, he was also just in Montreal also last fall saying anti-Semitic stuff in one of the protests, so same issue. The way we deal with him back then was just by being bigger, better leaders and drowning him out. So I think if you create a culture, an organizational culture where that's not the tone, then that person becomes marginalized. So it's not about, with elements are there in a space that is public, more about who has leadership and who gets to define the culture of the movement. I think that's the battle. And so if you take leadership of the movement and you define a cultural norm of what is acceptable in a space that makes that speech not acceptable, then you have a protest you can attend. If that speech becomes the leadership of the movement, then you have a different ethical issue. And like when you're doing protests, the question is who's the organizer and what are they saying? Not who's in the street, because everybody can be in the street, in my experience.
Hi, good evening, bonjour. So you mentioned something that, diversity is so powerful, and when people understand that, things are fantastic. I agree. But in many cases, that's not the reality. We're talking here about freedom of expression and even protest, that type of thing. But sometimes people don't even have to protest. Here in Canada, people not only talk about EDI, they usually exclude the A for accessibility, so people with disabilities are not included. They're excluded by design. But everybody would agree, yes, we're a diverse country, aren't we? We celebrate it, aren't we? Everybody says that, and if you disagree, good for you for disagreeing. But in some provinces, they have already started to curtail the rights of LGBTQ people, right? But what I notice is that this type of conversations, and I know this was organized way before whatever is happening here now, but right now, if you turn the TV, everything related to freedom of expression is for the scandal du jour, or the terrible things that is happening today. And what about all the other conversations that we have that are not threatening to the big powers? Like the movement of people with disabilities, or LGBTQ people who are being legislated not to use their pronouns. Nobody talks about them because nobody's being threatening here, right? So how do we really see what is the ethics of freedom of speech, but whose speech? Or in the case of, I don't know if you were here in 2011 for we're the 99%, right? Peaceful protests everywhere. They were immediately criticized by many sides because that type of movement, that type of freedom of expression threatens the big powers in the system. And they are going to do whatever they can to stop it, right? So how do we see power and whose speech or who behavior, who protest we're considering as valuable of discussion?
That's a really great question, and I didn't see the time. That will be the last question after the two of you answer, and then we'll be able to conclude and chit-chat after that. Question of power, and I hear it, an echo a conversation we had before about self-censorship. How do you measure the limits of freedom of expression of people who don't express speech? Just like how do you see people who are invisible, or how do you have, or invisibilize? Yes. Invisibilized is more correct, and so how do we see this or reframe our conversation on freedom of expression to the groups that don't make it to the Power in Politics show? What?
How do I say this? There's a concept which you will be familiar with, or as a journalist, the concept is more kilometric. That is, if there is an event, let me put it this way. It becomes newsworthy, in my opinion, as soon as it becomes a political issue that can affect election outcome. Why do I say this? There's 8 million people died in Congo, DRC, for the past 10, 15 years.
That's right.
Nobody talks about it, you know. And you are talking about LGBT people who are being trashed everywhere. By the way, I still believe that diversity is the biggest strength you can think about. I mean, it's not about racial diversity, it's about intellectual diversity, about anything diversity, but except we don't talk about it. But back to a question, I think until it becomes political, I'm afraid and actually even angry, I would say, if I may, that we that will not come to light as something newsworthy. That's my reading. But that may be too cynical, but that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. Yes, I agree. For some reasons, these questions are being instrumentalized now in some culture wars, and it's hard to figure out how to react. Just at the theoretical level, it is true that freedom of expression is typically thought as a negative freedom, freedom against the interference of either other groups more powerful or the state, right? And there are good historical reasons, because speech was so often suppressed, or people were killed or jailed because of their views and so on. So freedom of expression, first and foremost, it's and freedom as non-interference. Others should not interfere with our speech acts, and we need that, right? But that doesn't suffice. That doesn't provide like equal access to the public sphere. It doesn't grant a political voice to those who are invisibilized. We need other means. It's not freedom of expression by itself which will create more equal conditions for having a political voice. You're right. I don't have a magic bullet, unfortunately, but you're totally right.
Thank you for that. Before we close, I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you, because you mentioned it. This gets very concrete, very fast, and we're talking about those concepts, but it's actually a lot of lived experience. And I want to thank also, I want to thank Jocelyn, but I think Alexie, you mentioned in passing a lot of violent experiences, memories. I just want to just name that. Shit gets real really fast when it comes to freedom of expression, and that, I had the opportunity to moderate a symposium at Rideau Hall because the Governor General, and you were there, the Governor General decided to make that issue an issue of online violence, specifically against women, her thing for a mandate. And just being in that room is very powerful to have a conversation there because of the institutional weight you have behind that. And I think it's a similar thing here that's happening within the University of Toronto, within Massey College, with the Royal Society of Canada, having that conversation here. I want to thank you, the organizers, for opening this space up here. I know that personally, with the threats and the hate speech that I get, I find it very empowering, and it gives me agentivity to be able to have this conversation and think about the issue and take back control over, at least an illusion of it, over a conversation of freedom of expression, what's happening with it, what's wrong with our society, why is it so violent. And I want to thank Jocelyn and Alexie for sharing this expertise on it, because I think that when our thoughts are getting clearer on this, not only are we better equipped to think about it, but we're better equipped to be resilient and resistant, or resist everything that goes on in our society that threatens that principle and basically our basic safety as people who have thoughts. Thank you, Massey. Thank you to the Royal Society, and thank you to our speakers, and thank you for being such an amazing audience as well.